For some reason, just the last couple of weeks, even before I started thinking about this, Psalm 46 has just been on my mind, just dealing with all this craziness. And, my goal tonight is just to provide you with some encouragement as we look at that psalm, and just because we're all seeking for peace, whether it's, dealing with what we're dealing with now or just day-to-day life. I mean, how many of you in the past month have felt like your world's been turned upside down?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Feels like the world's fighting against you.
Absolutely, every step of the way.
Yeah.
Just in my own personal life, just, I guess, locally and in my own personal life, we've dealt with multiple storms in the past month. We've got this virus going on. It seems like it's escalating day to day. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, literally, or the next 6 hours. Society as we know, it's been shut down. It's just crazy, man. It seems like there's trouble all around us. And like I said, with my personal example, my job, I teach at the school, and so, my routine is shot. Obviously school's closed, and so I'm not doing what I normally do. I know you talked about boredom and just how, I feel like I'm sitting at home and I want to be useful, but my routine's upside down. That storm came through last week and we had a tree fall on our house, and it's just one lick after the next, and you're like, man, what's going on? And like I said, your situation may be different, and it may not even be connected to those storms or this virus, but you mentioned some jobs, and just, it's like, what the heck is going on? And how do I deal with it? And I guess what I want to look at tonight is the fact that trouble's real, and difficulty's real. If you look in Job 5:7, one of Job's friends, we don't get a lot of quality information from Job's friends in the book of Job. But one thing that one of his friends says in Job 5:7, he says, "But man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward." And basically what he's saying is, trouble's going to happen. You can't avoid it. It's going to come. If you think about a campfire, he's talking about a fire. If you see a campfire, you see sparks fly upward. He's saying that's how it happens. And so you're going to experience trouble. And not only is it real, but its effects are real. It affects you physically. It affects you emotionally. The more you think about it, the worse it gets. So what do we do about it? That's what I hope we can glean as we look at Psalm 46 tonight. What do we do about it? How do we overcome it? How do we exist in the middle of it? How do we move forward and not paralyze ourselves by, the more we think about things, the more we tend to paralyze ourselves. How do I avoid that? And the good news tonight is that God cares about you. God cares about me. That's the good news. And so we know that He's concerned about you, and we know that nothing exists in your life that He doesn't know about. Nothing exists in my life that He doesn't know about. And He's bigger than my trouble. He's bigger than your trouble with the jobs you spoke of. It's not something that He can't handle. But you still want answers, right? That's the human part of you. You're like, well, how do I deal with it? Like, I get that it's real, and I get that God's real, but how do I deal with it? And so I think the more that I've read Psalm 46, the more that I understand that it tells us how to deal with it. Verse 10 in Psalm, everybody knows Psalms 46:10. Whether you know that's where it's at, everybody knows that. It says, "Be still and know that I'm God." Everybody knows that. And so when all this stuff hit in the last month, I was thinking about that verse, and I thought, let's go back to the Psalm and really understand what the context is and what the whole chapter is saying. And so I think what it tells us is that a knowledge of God brings peace in troubled times. So that's the root of it. If you want to know, how do I get through this? How do I deal with it? A knowledge of God will bring peace. And that's what I want us to see in Psalm 46. I'm going to read it, and then we'll just go through it real quick. It says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when the morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters His voice and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come behold the works of the Lord, how He has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire." And in that verse that we all know, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." So the author is going to do three things there, I think, that we're going to look at. He basically presents to us, listen, there is trouble. It's real. It exists. But there is a God. He's real, and He exists. I'm going to tell you a little something about Him. And then lastly, He says, listen, there can be peace regardless of the trouble. And I'm going to tell you how. That's what the author's doing. And so, just real quick before we get there, it's important, I think, to understand a little bit of context about Scripture. And the Psalms are a little different, but usually when you open your Bible and you're reading a chapter, you need to know what comes before it and what comes after it, and what's going on. Another question to ask is, well, why did the guy that wrote this write it? Why did he write it? You know, I need to know why he wrote it to understand the true purpose. And so what's interesting about this psalm is if you do a little research, different people think different things. Different people think that it was written at different times in different situations, different wars. Israel was dealing with different things at different times. But nobody really knows. We don't have a clear picture. So I think for us to speculate about that would just be, maybe a waste of time is too strong a language, but it's not profitable for us, right? But what we do know is it doesn't take a rocket scientist to read this psalm and know whoever wrote this was going through something, was going through a difficult time. Life was not easy, right? And he's writing it to people, I think, that are dealing with the same thing, that are dealing with a difficult time in an effort to show them it's possible to have peace, and this is how. You know, you can do it your way and you can struggle, or you can follow this plan that I'm presenting to you, that God's presenting to me, that I'm presenting to you, and if you want to find peace. And so, like I said, he's going to show us that there's trouble. He's going to show us, but even though there's trouble, there's a God, and he's going to show us that there can be peace, and this is how. Right? So let's look at the beginning. You know, in verse 1, he says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. All he's doing right there is telling you, this is what I'm writing about. God is our refuge and strength. He is our help. All these troubled times that you're dealing with, you may think that you can't overcome them, but you can overcome them with God. And so I'm going to write to you about that. And then he goes and starts in verse 2, and he's talking about trouble. And the first thing that he says is, listen, trouble is real. It's real. It's not made up. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's real. Right? And he describes trouble as the earth giving way and the mountains being moved into the sea. Some pretty strong language, right? He's getting real creative here, and he's painting this picture of real catastrophe. Right? And so I mentioned, you know, we had those tornadoes come through Cookville. Anybody see any pictures of that? I mean, that's catastrophe. I mean, you got a house that's not there anymore, blown into a million pieces. That's catastrophe. That's awful dang close to the earth's giving way. I mean, if that was your house, that's your earth giving way. Right?
I was in the Hope Center down there in Nashville, and luckily come back here, and when that hit, it hit the backside of the women's department.
Oh, man.
When it hit Cookville and Nashville area.
Right. Yeah, I know there was a Christian school that was just no more.
Yeah.
Right there in Nashville. So I mean, that's catastrophe, and that's the picture that he's painting, right? And we've seen, like I talked about with the virus. I mean, that's catastrophe. That's worldwide. That's a real catastrophe. And I think that, you know, it may be possible that the psalmist was talking about a catastrophe of that scale. You know, that may be what he's talking about. But it's also a representation of real trouble in our life, just day to day. Regardless of storms, regardless of viruses, just there can be trouble every day. Right? So everyday tragedy, in some way, it hits on an individual level. But the world keeps turning. Right? And so your world may get rocked, and everybody else keeps moving on. And you're left to deal with it. So think about your own personal experience, right? I'm confident that all of us, every single one of us in here has had trouble hit at some point in our life. And we can relate to what this guy's saying, right? And like I mentioned before, you ever felt like the earth just gave way, like your earth just gave way. It's been turned upside down. It could be death. It could be the loss of a job, like you talked of earlier. It could be the loss of a home or just a loss of a place to stay. It may not have physically been removed, but maybe you're evicted or not, or you can't stay there anymore. It could just be relationship trouble. You know, you can fill in the blank. It can be anything. But the point is, trouble is real. It's real. And this psalm got me thinking, and it reminds me of Jesus' words. He gives a parable of the wise and the foolish builder, right? The guy in Matthew, the guy that builds a house on the rock and the guy that builds a house on the sand. Right? And this psalm reminds me of that, because one thing that stands out to me in that parable is that Jesus says, the rains fell and the wind blew. He doesn't say, just in case the rains fall, or just in case the wind blows, just in case these storms come. That's not what he says. Or if they happen to come, that's not what he says. He says again. So that tells me that trouble's real and trouble's going to come. At some point in your life, everyone's going to have to deal with trouble. So it's important to know how to deal with it. And then in John 16, Jesus says that we're going to have trouble. I mean, he just came out. There's a couple places in the gospel where it says, and Jesus spoke plainly to them. Right? And he's saying here plainly, there's going to be trouble. Trouble's a real thing. And then the psalmist goes on in verse 3 and he talks about trouble has an impact. Right? It's not only is it real, but it impacts you. He talks about the roar and the foam of the sea. He says, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. That's some interesting language too. And he's painting this picture again. And think about the roar of the water. Right? Think about the roar of the water. What does it have a tendency to produce? I mean, if you're in the middle of a hurricane, what's that produce? It produces fear. I mean, that roar, similar to the roar of, say, a lion or some kind of loud noise, it produces fear. And trouble easily produces fear. It produces anxiety. Whether it's actual physical trouble to my body, or again, the example used of a job, I mean, it produces all these thoughts. My mind starts racing. What am I going to do about this? What am I going to do about that? How am I going to pay for this? How am I going to feed my kid? How am I going to, I mean, all these things pop into your head. It made me think about, I have a really good buddy that was in the middle of those storms in Cookeville, and talking to him on the phone, he said, the one thing I can't shake, man, is the noise of that tornado. He's like, I can't get that out of my head. You know, and that noise produces a fear. Right? And it's a similar thing that the psalmist is talking about when he says, think about the roar of the water, the foam of the water, or the mountains trembling. It's this idea of fear. Trouble can produce fear, and that can have a real impact on our lives. And like I mentioned earlier, fear can paralyze you. It can paralyze you. And you can apply that to your own personal trouble. Again, economic loss, the loss of a home, whatever. How am I going to get by? Maybe I've got a loved one that gets sick. We're dealing with this virus. I mean, at some point, the chances are, with each of us, that's going to impact our family at some point. Right? And that's going to produce fear. I mean, if you got a phone call today of somebody that's really close to you, and it said, hey, so-and-so's contracted the virus and is in the hospital. I mean, what thoughts are going to start racing through your head? I mean, I know I have a professor in college that I saw a message on social media today that his oldest daughter, this is about 3 hours ago, his oldest daughter has pneumonia, is in the hospital. They're putting her on a ventilator, and they can't go to the hospital. So she's in a hospital room all by herself on a ventilator. I mean, imagine that. That would produce fear. That would produce anxiety. So trouble is real. Trouble is real, and its effects are real. And what we tend to do is we tend to dwell on it. Right? All those thoughts start racing in your head, and the more you think, the worse it gets, and things start getting bigger and worse in your mind. That's not the way to go about it. That's not the way to go about it. That's not the appropriate response. And the psalmist is trying to tell us that, because look in verse 3, it's real interesting. He starts off in verse 1, he says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. That's who he is. And then in verse 2, he says, therefore. And then in verse 3, though. So therefore my world is about to be shaken upside down. And though it may cause me to fear, or though it can produce fear, I'm not going to let it. Because I'm going to trust in who God is. So trouble is real. It has real effects. But as believers, we're not to fear, because God's our fortress. Right? That's what he's saying. And now he's going to shift and he's going to say, listen, we've talked about trouble enough. Yeah, it's real. I don't have to tell you it's real. Right? You've lived it. He's saying, but there's a God. And he moves from that trouble to a presentation of God. And he's proclaiming this reality of God and intimate life with him. It can be a reality. And so he presents three things that I want you to see. The first one is that God reigns. If we get to verse 4, it says, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. If it's the city of God, whose city is it? It's God's. He's in control. He's on the throne. It's the holy habitation of the Most High. When you see Most High, what do you know? He's in charge. Right? So God reigns. I think this gives us a picture, too. It gives us a picture of the present, and it gives us a picture of the future. Right? And so presently, when we think of city of God, I think he's talking about the church. He's talking about believers. Those people who have placed their faith and committed their life to Christ. And he talks about this river, right, in the midst of it. He says, God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. And just before that, he says, there's a river whose streams Make glad the city of God. There's this river running through the city. There's this river running through the church. Right? And that speaks of our salvation because it's a river of life. When you got running water, there's life. When you think about a pond. When a pond just sits there, it gets real stagnant. It's nasty, right? When you got a river and moving, it's usually clean, it's usually nice, and it's this image of life. In John 7:38, Jesus said these words, which really speak to what the psalm is saying here. He says, "Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Right? He's talking about salvation. And we see a picture of that here as the river is running through the church. God's presence resides with his church, and he reigns victoriously over them. Right? That's the present. But the future, this gives us a glimpse of the future too, because it gives us a picture of heaven's real. It gives us this picture of the city of God. No matter what trouble you're dealing with today, I can know that heaven's real. Heaven is real. Right? It's a place where all the people of God will live forever in his presence, right? Without trouble. And it's a place where Jesus Christ will reign as king forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So both of these thoughts that are brought on by this picture of this city of God reveal that not only is God real, but he reigns. He's the one that's in control. He goes on to show that God isn't moved. God's not shaken. No matter what trouble you deal with and how it shakes you, God's not shaken. He says, God's in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. So he's talking about believers again. And he says that these people, these believers, they can't be moved. The people of God can't be plucked out of the Father's hand and out of the Father's protection. If I'm a believer, he's got me. He can't take me out of his hand. John 10:28 says, I give them eternal life. This is Jesus speaking. He says, I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all. He reigns. And no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. Now, I'm a logical guy. I like black and white things, logic, straight lines. Don't like curvy lines. I like straight lines. So if that's true, if we know that God, that the believers can't be plucked out of his hand, right? Then we have to know that God can't be moved either. Right? God can't be shaken. Malachi 3:6 says, For I, the Lord, do not change. I don't change. God's the same he was yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Doesn't change. He can't be moved. He can't be shook by anything. Hebrews 13:8 says the same thing about Jesus Christ. It says Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So regardless of circumstance, regardless of calamity, regardless of what happens in your life, God's not shaken by it. He knows exactly what's going on. He rules and he reigns. Nothing takes him off his game. He's not surprised by anything. So your situation doesn't catch him off guard. What the author's doing here is he's reminding you, listen, take a deep breath. God is in control. God's in control. It may not seem like it, but God is in control. And then the last thing he shows us is that God is all-powerful. Right? And you've kind of gotten that picture already. But in verse 6, he makes it as clear as can be. He says, the nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice and the earth melts. It's a pretty big picture right there. Right? He draws us back to the nations and the kingdoms of the world. And he says, man views these as extremely powerful. Think about the United States of America. Right? I mean, you live here, I live here. Think about the United States of America. How it's presented as this mighty nation. Right? That maybe the strength of our economy. Right? Compared to the world. The strength of our military compared to the world. Right? And most of us probably believe, if somebody really pressed you, all of us in here believe, you know what? No other nation in the world can take us down. We're the most powerful nation in the world. Right? That's what we think. There's nothing we can't conquer, but notice the power of God. Right? What's it say? He says, the nations rage and the kingdoms totter, even the United States of America. They scheme and they plan, but no matter what they do, all God has to do is what? Speak. It says clearly, he utters his voice and the earth melts. His word alone can bring the nations down and melt the world. That's all you got to do is speak. And maybe you think, well, that's a little crazy, man. All he's got to do is talk. That's crazy. We'll go back to Genesis. How did it all begin? Let there be light. Boom. All he did was speak. And he created the world. All it took was his voice. Right? Proverbs 16:9 says, the heart of a man plans his way. Do you make plans? I make plans. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Those plans that I make, they don't mean anything unless God wants it to happen. He's the one that's in complete control. Verse 8 and 9 gives us an even better picture of that. It says, come behold the works of the Lord. Look at what he can do. How he has brought desolation on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. In case you didn't, this really jumped out to me this week. But have you ever heard anybody say the Bible's not relevant? It's not relevant for today. Well, listen to this. Think about the virus. Think about the virus. Has it had an impact on the world? Yeah. Could it qualify as desolation? I mean, I think it qualifies as desolation. You know, it says, he has brought desolation on the earth. I think that virus qualifies. And it's real interesting that the next thing it says is he makes wars cease to end. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. When's the last time you heard something about ISIS? When's the last time you heard something about any war since this virus started? Everything just seemed to come to a hush. And everybody's concerned about the virus.
Yeah, I'm afraid of going in with China.
I mean, he's in control. He's in complete control, and he's all-powerful. So the point of this section that the psalmist is writing is he's trying to draw us back to God as our refuge. He says, though trouble is real, so is God. And you're supposed to know that God reigns, he's unshakable, and he's all-powerful. And then he's going to present us with the plan, right? He says, you want to know how to have peace? This is how you have peace. Peace can be attained, even in the most troubling of times. And we come to verse 10, which says, be still and know that I am God. Right? Everybody's familiar with that verse. You've heard it. But do we view it as a suggestion, or do we view it as a command? Is it something we just forget about, or is it something we take seriously? We just put it on the back burner. Notice the first thing that we're told to do is to be still. Now, how contrary is that to your human nature? Who wants to sit still? What'd you tell me earlier? I was really bored this week. Right? I mean, we sit still. We don't want to sit still. We want to move. And so to us, this whole be still thing doesn't make a lot of sense. Man was made to work. He was made to do things. Right? So what's the author talking about? Why is he saying be still? I want to be clear. I don't think he's telling us that we're to sit back and do anything. That we're not just to sit back and not do anything, right? That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is stop worrying. Stop worrying. And a better translation, and maybe it's what your Bible says, is quit striving against. Right? Stop. Cease striving against your trouble, which just means quit worrying about it, quit obsessing over it, and quit trying to fix it all yourself. Quit trying to fix it all yourself. If we're honest with ourselves, we all obsess and worry over things that we don't really have control over. Right? I mean, I'm notorious this time of year. What's really crazy is I'm probably less stressed out in the middle of all this than normal, because usually this is the middle of baseball season, and I'm watching the weather every 5 hours and wanting to know, when's it going to rain? Is it going to rain? How much is it going to rain? And it just stresses me out. But at the end of the day, I don't have any control over that. I don't have any control over the rain. Quit worrying about your trouble and quit worrying about things that you can't control, because what does that accomplish? Nothing. So the psalmist is telling us, stop. And again, this natural human reaction to that is, well, if I stop, nothing's going to get accomplished. But I want you to wait. Wait. Don't believe that. Because notice, is being still all that he tells us to do? No. He says, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. That's what verse 10 says. So we're not just commanded to be still, we're commanded to know God. Not only do we just know that he exists, but we're to know who he is. It's his intimate know. It's not just a casual, yeah, he's out there. I want to know who he is. So in light of that, what do we know? Let's think about that for just a minute. What do we know? What do we know about God's nature? A couple things I want to point out to you. Maybe you never thought about this before. The first is God does everything for His own glory. He does everything for His own glory. Psalm 23. Anybody know Psalm 23 off the top of your head? You may do and not even know that's what it is. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Listen to these things. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness. How nice do those things sound? And He's doing them for who? For me. But why is He doing them? Look at the next verse. He says, for His name's sake. He's doing all of those things. He's my shepherd. He brings me peace, lying down in green pastures, still waters. That's peace right there. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness. Why? For His name's sake, to bring glory to Himself. God does everything to bring glory to Himself. God's sovereign. Just means He's in complete control of everything. 1 Chronicles 29:11-12 says, yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. All. There's 3 little letters. All. That means everything that's in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. God is completely sovereign. He's in control of all things. He has a purpose. Right? He's not just running around aimlessly doing things off a whim. Well, I think I'll try that today. That's not who God is. He's got a purpose. Philippians 2:12-13 says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. He's got a purpose. He's got a purpose in your life. And then Romans 8:28 tells us, well, He's going to work all things to good for those that love Him. Right? He's going to work all things to good. Think about this. Maybe you never thought about it this way. You like movies? All right, take some movie that you really enjoy watching. And let's say you're about 45 minutes in, and the tragedy strikes, or the climax, whatever it is, the peak of the movie, right? And you freeze frame it right there. Probably not one of your favorite movies. I mean, if it stopped and ended right there, you'd be like, that's the biggest bunch of junk in the world, and you walk out of there mad. Why would they end the story that way? Right? But if you watch the rest of the movie, you get the big picture. You can't take the movie and take 30-second snapshot of the movie and say, this is the biggest piece of junk ever. You got to see the big picture, right? But think about your life the same way. I mean, you're caught in, I had a really bad day today, and you want to freeze frame it, and you just want to think how awful. God's got a plan and a purpose. He's working the big picture, and I got to trust in that. I can't just freeze frame it, right? And then the last thing that you got to know is that He's claimed the victory. God's claimed the victory. And the author alluded that in the middle of the psalm. Through Christ's work on the cross, He claimed victory over sin and death and provided a way for you to be saved and reconciled to God the Father. That's victory. And He's already won it. Too often, I was listening to a good buddy of mine this week, and he said something that really hit me right in the face. He said, too often we live our lives for the victory. And here's what he meant. We try to be good enough to do enough right things or solve our own problems. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to live for the victory. We're trying to make the victory happen. Right? But when we as believers, if we've placed our faith in Christ, the victory's already been won. Why are we fighting so hard for a victory that's already been won? We don't have to live for victory and be anxious. We're called to live in victory. Because that's what God's already done. He's already won the victory. And I apologize, because we only got 3 ladies in here, and I don't want to stereotype, but I'm a sports guy. And right before I came over here, actually, I was watching the World Series from 1995, and the Braves won the World Series. And I'm watching that game. I mean, there's no baseball on. It's killing me. I gotta watch the baseball. So I'm watching that game, and you can look at that 2 different ways. In 1995, I was watching that game, but I wasn't watching it the same way I watched it today. I was watching it like this, and I was probably doing this, pacing back and forth, because that's what I do. I stand up, and my wife makes fun of me, and I'm watching the game because I don't know how it's going to end. Right? I'm anxious. I'm frustrated. Maybe even fearful. Oh my gosh, they're going to lose. But today, when I'm watching it, I know they won. So I'm just relaxed and I'm enjoying everything and seeing things new. You know, that's how we're called to live our life. We know that we win. If I'm a believer in Christ, I know that He has already won the victory. And so when I know that, yeah, my trouble really may stink today. But if I can frame it in that light, it's not that big a deal. Because I already claimed the victory. Right? So, the last thing I want to do, I want to make it practical. And I want to try to make it real. You know, because you may, yeah, I get it. I get it. Trouble's real, God's real. I'm supposed to know that He's real. And I'm supposed to know that He's bigger than my trouble. I get it. But what does it really mean? Like, what can I do? How can I apply this to my life? How can I walk out of here today and find that peace that you're talking about? Right? And so, 5 things. And trust. 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 The first thing I got to do, if I want to do what the psalmist tells me to do, be still and know that I'm God. I got to turn to the Lord. I got to turn to Him. Am I trying to solve everything on my own? Right? I got to turn to Him. I got to turn to Him in prayer. What's my prayer life like? Am I really talking to Him? I mean, think about the person that you're closest to. Maybe it's your mama, or maybe you got a best friend, or whatever. And when something happens, first thing you do, pick up the phone and you want to talk to that person. And if I think about myself as a coach and I'm dealing with something, I've got a list of 2 or 3 people where I want to know what that guy thinks. Right? But how often do I turn to prayer and talk to the one who's claimed the victory? That's the first thing I need to do. Second thing I have to do is recognize Him as the option. As the option. Not a option, the option. Jesus spoke in John. He said, abide in me. Right? Abide in me. Not just turn to me for 5 minutes because that's what you're supposed to do. Abide in me. Again, am I trying to fix everything? Is my first go-to, well, I'm going to see what I can do about this. And then if that doesn't work, then I'm going to see what you can do, God. Or am I abiding in Him? The next thing I have to do is I got to understand what God has done for me. I got to stop and remember. You know, there's a lot of places in Scripture that call on us to remember. So I can easily look back in my past. Remember that time I was in that jam? Remember that time that happened and I thought my world was turned upside down and God worked through that? I mean, there's no better example in the Bible than Joseph. I mean, imagine if your siblings threw you in a ditch, you got sold into slavery, you get transported to another country, you eventually get thrown into prison for 12 years, right? And then He brings you out of all of that and you rise to second in command and you have an opportunity to save your family. And there's a verse at the very end of Genesis where Joseph says, you know what? All this bad stuff happened. But now I can see that it was your plan all along and it was for my good. I mean, it's amazing. So I have to look back and remember what God has done for me in my life and know He's a faithful God. He was faithful then. He'll be faithful now. And He'll be faithful down the road when I encounter the next trouble. And maybe you're sitting here tonight, and maybe some people, I've heard people say this before, well, I don't have that. I can't look back and see that. All you got to do is turn back to the Gospels. Jesus Christ went to the cross for you. There's nothing He could do any greater for you than go to the cross and die. So I can't even sing that tune. Well, God's never done anything for me. Yeah, He has. He's done the greatest thing He could ever do for you. And He's provided a path for you to be saved and reconciled to God the Father. So remember what God has done for you. The next thing I do is I got to sprint to the Word. Sprint to the Word. Not just, well, I guess I'll eventually get to my Bible. I mean, Pastor Dale right there was talking to me this week and talking about a guy who was hawing around and talking about, well, I think this, and his simple response was, have you read the book? Have you read the book? Well, I've read part of it. Read the book. I'm going through a difficult time, man. Turn to the Word. Turn to the Word if I want to find peace and comfort. Because like I mentioned before, God's faithful. And the last thing is, toe the line. Toe the line, which just means be obedient. Live in obedience. God's called me to live a certain way. If He is going to be a faithful God, right? He's been faithful in the past, and He'll be faithful in the future. The least that I can do is be faithful to Him. I mean, that's what faith is, right? Even in the most difficult of times, I'm called to be faithful. And when I'm faithful, I'm giving God permission to work. I'm giving God permission to work. One of the most powerful things, and it just popped in my head, one of the most powerful things that I ever heard was a pastor say, hell heaven's not a place for people that don't want to go to hell. Heaven is not a place for people who don't want to go to hell. Heaven is a place for people that love God. Right? And God's not going to force you to go to heaven. Right? I mean, if you're going to stand there defiantly and say, I don't want to believe in you, He's going to say, fine, have it your way, and you can go to hell. Right? And if I'm not going to be faithful and obedient to Him, if I'm going to stand there and say, I'm going to try to fix this myself, and then maybe I'll come back to you, God's going to say, okay, if you don't want me, if you don't want to give me permission to work in your life, okay. So if I'm going through difficulty and I want to find peace, I got to be faithful. I got to be faithful because I'm giving Him permission to work in that situation. I'm giving Him permission to work with me by being faithful. So again, I got to turn to the Lord. And how's my prayer life? I got to recognize Him as the option, not a option, and I've got to abide in Him. Thirdly, I got to understand what He's done for me. Just remember all the things that He's done for you and know how faithful He is. I got to sprint to the Word. Get in the book. Read the book. And I got to toe the line. Be obedient. Philippians 4:6 says, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And if I do those things, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. If I want the peace that surpasses all understanding, all I got to do is know God. I got to slow down. And in my heart of hearts, to some extent, I wonder if that's not what's going on right now. God's saying, listen, slow down. You got your hands in so many things, and you got your attention in so many places. He's like, right here's where it needs to be. Get your attention on me. Slow down. And you're complaining all the time about the difficulty and the lack of peace, and I'm on the run all the time, and I don't know up from down. If you want peace, just be still and know who I am. Spend time with me. Get to know me. God's calling us back to Himself. And so I know, just talking today, you spoke of all these things that are just difficult right now. And really, the craziest thing right now, in my opinion, is the unknown. Right? Everybody, we're talking about the virus. When's this going to be over? When can I go back to my normal? Right? If I'm dwelling on those things, I'm not going to find peace. If I want peace, I got to dwell in God and know who He is. Right? Let's pray. Lord, we thank You for, just that You provide answers. And that all we have to do is turn to You. And that regardless of what we're going through, regardless of what we're dealing with, it's real. And it has real effects on us. But we can know, without a shadow of a doubt, that You are real. And that You're bigger than all of those things. Lord, I pray that we would just stop, that we would just slow down and abide in You, trust in You, and recognize You as the faithful God who's in control of all things, and trust that You have a plan and purpose for our life. And that all of these things that You're doing through us, around us, are working for our good, so that ultimately we can bring glory to You. I pray that we can rest in that, even in the most difficult situations. Lord, I pray for these ladies in here today, and just that, again, that You would open doors in their life that they need to walk through, that You would provide jobs, that You would provide housing, that You would just draw close to them, Lord, and I pray that we would be all bold examples of faith in You as we leave this place. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.